What are the commonalities between geniuses? That's what I'm going to be exploring in this video as a psychotherapist. I'm interested in creating new, helpful and healthy ways of being. Where better to start than some people that have been labelled as genius? Not the loose labels, but people that have really achieved lots, and whether it's healthy or not, we'll explore some of that and how we can put some of those to good use in our own lives. So you might have heard Newton didn't leave his room for 2 years, or Mozart could hear an entire symphony in his head before writing even a single note. Tesla claimed he built and tested his inventions entirely in his mind, ever before touching a physical object. We call these people geniuses. We put them on pedestals, we write biographies about them, make films about their lives. But when do we ask, what was actually going on inside their heads? And how can we apply that to our life? Is it even useful? Not the achievements, not the timelines. I'm talking about the psychology, the obsessions, the quirks, the way they thought, felt and experienced the world. Often in ways that look nothing like the people around them might have been doing it. And that's what this video is about. And I'll make a couple more videos about this further, breaking it down into smaller parts. The research reveals decades of serious study is that across fields like music and maths, painting and physics, there are patterns, recurring signatures, kind of hidden code. That's what I'm making this episode about, just about the code. Let's start with an honest admission. Genius is a slippery word. It gets thrown at people who are very good at things, people who are famous, people who have one big idea, and that's not quite what we mean here. But also, being a genius doesn't make you a good person, so that's also important to remember. Some leading academics and experts on this subject have spent sort of decades building databases of creators, leaders, running statistical analysis on them to understand things more, treating historical figures as data points, basically looking for patterns across hundreds of lives. What they have sort of found is that genius, or more precisely, extraordinary creative achievement, is not a simple thing. It's not just high intelligence alone. It's not just hard work. It's not a gift that lands in your lap. It's a cluster of things, a constellation of traits, drives and ways of experiencing the world that tend to appear together across wildly different fields, different centuries, different cultures. So what's in this cluster? First thing is openness. The single personality trait most consistently linked with creative achievement across study after study is something psychologists call openness to experience. It's one of the big 5 personality dimensions, the most robust framework in personality psychology according to some. And it covers things like curiosity, imagination, aesthetic sensitivity, a love of novelty, a tolerance for ambiguity. The willingness to sit with a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Analysis putting together data across the arts and sciences found that creative people are consistently higher in openness than their less creative peers, more curious, more driven, more willing to break with convention. But here's where it gets interesting. Openness isn't one thing. It has 2 faces. Psychologists ran 4 separate studies totaling over 1,000 participants and found a clean split. Openness in its aesthetic, emotional flavor, predicts creative achievements in the arts, while intellect, the drive to engage with abstract ideas and systems, predicts achievements in the sciences. Which means even with the genius profile, the flavor of openness tells you something about which world you're drawn into. And that's something useful for you to think about. Van Gogh and Einstein both scored high on this dimension, but in very different ways, right? And that matters. The deeper point is this. People high in openness are drawn to worlds of possibility. They don't find uncertainty threatening, they find it interesting. And that matters enormously because creative work is mostly uncertain. Mostly not knowing, it's mostly being wrong before you're right. And that's the significance of it. Now, openness tells you what you're drawn towards, but it doesn't explain the intensity which geniuses pursue it. So for that, we need another concept, and one that was coined by a psychologist who called it rage to master. So she studied gifted children who showed extraordinary ability early and found 3 things that consistently set them apart. First, the ability to learn faster than their peers. Second, the tendency to march to their own drummer, to be independent, non-conforming, guided by their own inner compass rather than external approval. And third, and this is the most crucial one, an almost compulsive drive to master their domain. Not just hard work, not discipline enforced from outside, but something that came from within, what they couldn't turn off. An obsession masquerading as a hobby, a need to be looked to outsiders like passion. It looked like to outsiders as passion, but from the inside it looked more like hunger. Here's what's important about that framing. The drive is intrinsic. It's not about rewards, grades, recognition, or praise. It comes from inside. It connects directly with decades of research on creativity and motivation, findings that tested in experiment after experiment, intrinsic motivation principle of creativity. So that's what people are most creative when they're driven by the work itself, by interest, by curiosity, by the challenge of it. The moment you do it for external reward, for money, approval, surveillance, competition, creativity suffers. Geniuses almost universally don't do it for the audience. The audience is, at best, a side effect. And that's the same thing as authenticity. Doing things because you authentically like it, the side effect is that other people might find that interesting as well. So when the rage to master connects with a task at exactly the right level of difficulty, not too easy, not too impossible, something else happens. Again, people have spent decades studying it, have named it flow. Flow is a state of complete absorption. Time disappears, self-consciousness dissolves. The work and the worker become for a while the same thing. In this study, 91 eminent creators, including 14 Nobel laureates, were interviewed. And what they found about the creative personality was at its core a word: complexity. Creative people, they argued, don't fit easy stereotypes. They hold contradictory traits, intention. They're energetic and often need enormous rest. They're smart and sometimes naive, playful and rigorous, private and passionately engaged with the world. Humble when it comes to their work, absolutely certain. There's 10 paradoxical trait pairs, not because geniuses are contradictory, but because they're whole. They don't resolve the tension, they live in it. And this, they said, is where the tortured genius myth starts to crack. Most creative people in this sample were not depressed, broken, or at war with themselves. They were in a deep sense alive. More alive, perhaps, than most. We'll come back to the mental health question in a later episode. It's more complicated, more interesting than the myth suggests. So we'll look at that in another video. Here's a piece of neuroscience that I find a bit strange, and I want to share it carefully. So your brain right now is filtering. It's screening out loads of information, sounds, sensations, memories, associations that it decides are irrelevant. And that filtering mechanism is called latent inhibition. And it's one of the ways your brain maintains focus and sanity. Most of us have high latent inhibition. We're good at ignoring things that don't seem to matter. I know I'm one of those people. Researchers found something striking though. Eminent creative achievers showed significantly lower latent inhibition than general population. Their brains were letting in more noise, more stimuli, more seemingly irrelevant connections. In this peer-reviewed study, highly creative achievers were 7 times more likely to have reduced latent inhibition compared to less creative people. Now, here's a crucial part. Reduced latent inhibition on its own isn't a superpower, but in someone without the cognitive capacity to manage the flood, it's associated with psychosis, your brain being overwhelmed by what it can't screen out. But in someone with high intelligence and strong working memory, that flood of irrelevant information becomes raw material. Connections between things that shouldn't connect. Patterns in the noise. This is, I think, one of the most important findings in the psychology of genius, because it explains both the gifts and the costs, not as opposites, but as two faces of the same coin. So before we go any further, let's deal with 3 things you've probably been told about genius that aren't quite right. The 10,000 hour rule, the practice whatever it is for 10,000 hours and you'll become world class. The researcher whose work it was based on spent years clarifying that this is not what data showed. The best violinist it originally studied had averaged around 7,400 hours by age 18. The 10,000 figure was an average, not a threshold, and the type of practice matters far more than raw hours. Deliberate practice, specifically targeting weaknesses with focused attention, is very different from just doing the thing repeatedly. The hours don't make the genius, the depth of engagement does. Though don't get me wrong, the hours definitely do help. So the lone genius, we love the image, the solitary figure working alone, making a breakthrough that changes everything. But even Einstein had collaborators. Darwin spent years in correspondence with hundreds of naturalists. Newton's famous line, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," wasn't forced modesty. Scientific co-authorship rose from roughly 1/3 of papers in 1900 to nearly 70% by World War II. The musician Brian Eno coined a better term, genius, the genius that emerges from ecology of talent, a scene, a moment, a group of people pushing each other. Geniuses are shaped by their worlds as much as they shape them. Genius equals high IQ. This one's persistent and partly true. You generally do need to have strong cognitive ability to do exceptional work. But above an IQ of roughly 120, more IQ doesn't reliably mean more creativity. It's what researchers call a threshold hypothesis. So once you're past that threshold, what differentiates is merely very smart from the genius creativity and personality, motivation, and the capacity for deep original thought, not a higher test score. So some of the most creatively gifted individuals have had learning disabilities. Some were written off early. The IQ test wasn't designed to measure what makes someone exceptional. So let's bring this together, the genius profile. As far as the research can tell us, it's something like this. High openness to experience, that's curiosity, imagination, willingness to sit with the unknown, an almost compulsive intrinsic drive to master a domain, so not for the reward, but because the work itself demands it. The capacity for flow, so total absorption, where the time stops and the work takes over. A filtering brain that lets in more than most, so a cognitive openness that can be overwhelming and also be very generative. And something harder to name, a refusal to be like anyone else. An independence that can look like arrogance or eccentricity or social difficulty, but is really just someone following an internal signal that overrides external pressure. So these traits clustered together, they don't guarantee anything. Plenty of people with all of them never produce anything the world calls genius. Luck, circumstance, timing, and community matter too. But when you look at the lives of people whose work genuinely changed something in any field, you find these patterns again and again. And in the videos I'll go on to do, I will break it down more individually in terms of field by field, so the arts, sciences, maths, etc. Artists whose inner lives are the most turbulent and whose relationship with mental health is the most complicated and most mythologized. Leaders whose genius looks completely different from the genius of a painter or a mathematician, but who share more with them than you'd expect. Mathematicians, perhaps the most extreme case of the kind of focused, inward, obsessive mind we've been describing. And scientists, where the profile shifts again, where the question of what actually drives a person to stare at the same problem for 20 years becomes urgent. Each field is a different lens on the same underlying question. What does it actually feel like to be the kind of person who changes things? There are myths to bust, patterns to trace, and some genuinely strange true stories along the way. I'll see you in the next one.